everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're sitting down with a brand new guest who has co-authored an incredibly interesting book. Her name is Natalie Perkins. The name of the book is In Trembling Boldness, Wisdom for Today from Ancient Jesus People. And so, Natalie, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have this time with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Definitely. So before we get into the book, can you take a few minutes to maybe tell us about yourself, especially for people who aren't familiar with you and your work? I know you're a pastor. So who are you? What are some things you do? Tell us what we need to know.
I'm a multi-hyphenate. I am a minister at Middle Church in New York City. I serve as the minister for digital strategy and engagement. I'm also a writer. I have this book here, and I'm a professional performer, musical theater mostly. But I have been doing a lot of singing with symphonies. I'm on my way to Indianapolis tomorrow, actually, to sing with the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra for their holiday season. They do a show there called Yuletide that I participate in every year. So
that's awesome.
yeah,
Is that online anywhere? Is that going to be online anywhere, or is it just in person?
That's just in Indianapolis. Yeah.
Gotcha.
I have an album that's online. Anywhere I guess you can find music sold. It's called Songs of Your Truth.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I'll put that link in the show notes. But how did you get involved? Like, if you've been doing music, I'm assuming you've been doing music for a long time. How did you get involved in church ministry? Was there like an overlap for you, or like what brought you to ministry in particular? Probably a long story, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't know. Like, I feel like I don't know a time when the two were separated. But I was actively not trying to do ministry. I was like, I don't want to do that. That's not for me. Like,
right.
God, you called the wrong person. Sort of energy for a long
Get somebody
time.
else.
And when that didn't work, I was like, okay, well, let me make a bargain with you. Like, here's the ways in which I can do that and still live like the life that I'm doing and want to live. And also didn't work.
Right.
So
God said, all right, we'll see how that works for you.
Yeah, cool. Like, we're gonna do this.
Yeah.
So it was another minister who kind of had been observing me that said, have you received a call to ministry? And I burst into tears. And had to do a little bit of reconciling with myself that really what I was pushing back around was my own sense of worthiness. It wasn't whether I wanted to or not. Honestly, it was that I didn't feel like I was good enough or that I deserved to be the person who would be called to work like this, or that like I had the right moral compass or whatever,
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is just attached to what we have been told churches and Christianity is and God is versus what it actually is, what it actually means to follow the way of Jesus, to have a relationship with God. All of that is different to me now than it was when I grew up, right?
Yeah.
And so when I was able to accept that this is a call, and I'm being called not in spite of, but because of, who I am, then I was able to really dig into, okay, so what do you believe and what do you really think about this? And seminary is a great place to do that sort of thing, right? Like,
it is. You sort out a lot of things there.
Yeah, you sure do. You're learning, a lot of just very concrete facts around stuff, and that just helps you understand, like, okay, so then what do I believe as a result of that? What still stands, what doesn't? And they call a seminary cemetery because it's where your faith goes to die. So it really just, I think, even when they say that, I really think it depends on the person and what it is that your faith is rooted in, right? Like, if it's rooted in having to be right or wrong, then yeah, I could see how it might be death dealing.
Yeah, for sure.
But if it's rooted in something bigger than you, something bigger than you, and something that's like life-giving, loving, then the facts mean something different in relationship to your faith.
That's right. Yeah, I've seen a lot of people go to seminary and, like you said, their faith does collapse. It does fall apart. But other people, like for me, I felt like in many aspects it did, but I felt like there was something there that was like, I want to put this back together to make
Yes. Hmm.
something new.
Hmm.
It's just going to
That's what I
evolve.
always
It's going to look
say.
different, but it's
Hmm.
still going to be there. It's going to look different.
Yep, that's what I always say is they dismantle it, and they should, right?
Hmm.
Like, let's take this whole thing apart. What do you actually think? And then it's up to you whether you rebuild it or not.
Correct. Yeah.
That's not the job of the seminary
Yeah.
to rebuild your faith. That's on you.
Yeah. They
Yeah.
give you the tools and then you have to go from
Hmm.
there. Right.
Hmm.
So tell me
Hmm.
about this position because I really quick, I'm interested about digital strategy and engagement because that's not like a position you hear about at a lot of churches, but it
Hmm.
grabbed my attention because when I went to seminary. I went back to get my DMin degree and I did my dissertation on how the church can use social media and technology to connect
Hmm.
with people. And so that's kind of where this podcast was kind of birthed from my final paper and stuff. So I'm interested to hear a little bit about that and kind of how that came to be.
Yeah, I think I have not been corrected on this. So I think that it's right and true that I'm only the second person in the UCC denomination. When I got ordained, I was only the second person in the denomination to be ordained into digital ministry.
Mm,
There was one other person before me, and she was not ordained. It's interesting. She's a Black woman as well.
mm,
Um, she was not ordained solely into digital ministry because at the time, people didn't take it seriously.
hmm.
So it was like digital ministry and I don't know, Christian education, let's say, like
Yep, yep, yep.
you can't just have this one call. We're going to have to like find this with something else to find it to be a worthy call in the UCC denomination. A call really is ultimately a job. Like, do you have a job that
Mm,
you're called to? And then, yes, you can be ordained to do that work.
hmm.
And then you can go from there after you're ordained. But, and so I think, and I got ordained, I'd been trying to get ordained for about 5 years. Got ordained in December of 2020.
Hmm.
So pretty quickly after the pandemic, they were like, "Oh, we need to get her down the road because
This is a real thing.
we actually need to know these things now."
Right.
That's my assessment of it. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of stuff, but like, yeah, and I'm the first I know, or think I know, in the Metro NYC area to be ordained into digital ministry.
Yeah.
Um,
Huh.
and I had been interested in it because I did a lot of traveling as a performer and trying to find churches and where do you go and how do you, do church
Mhm.
when you live on a bus, essentially. I lived on
Yeah.
a coach bus for like a year and a half of my life. And outside of even that, I was on the tour of Hairspray and Rent.
Mm,
Um, and then outside of that, just regional theaters, just trying to find, you know, basic things like where do you go to eat, who can do black hair,
right.
and where can I go to church,
Right.
Um, and so I kept trying to figure out where to go to church, and I stumbled across Life Church, which is
Mhm,
not a Black church, but
mhm,
what I learned was there were Life churches all over the country,
mhm.
and they do this sort of like Kaplan-esque model where every month, I don't know when they send it, but I imagine it's every month they send each of their church plants
Mhm,
the materials for the month, right?
mhm.
Here's like the 4 sermons that you're going to be preaching. Here's, the script and where you can put examples in from your own life or, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Here's the bulletin design. You just have to like go and print it. So it's very paint by numbers. And I felt like I could be in one city one week and get like the first sermon of the series there, be in a whole different city the next week
Interesting.
and get the second sermon of the series there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I felt like I got to grow spiritually because I stayed connected um, to a progression. I learned songs that I didn't grow up with, but because I heard them regularly as I was moving throughout the country, that
Yeah.
became mine.
Yeah.
They all had the same sorts of groups. They all had the same sorts of slides. It's very like I said, paint by numbers.
Yeah.
And it made me think that there's got to be other people besides me who are out on the road and gone from home for work and can't get to their home churches on Sunday. And what if
Yeah.
there's some way for them to do that? And that's what really piqued my interest about like what do we do at home? Like
Mm,
what does your local church do? The church that I was at when I first started seminary was not really in that space. I mean, no one was. that they weren't really thinking about digital ministry and what are we doing in that world, right?
Yeah.
But the second church that I interned at, which ended up being middle, there was someone there who was thinking about this. And so I finally had like a thought partner around that. And then there was some teasings of this sort of work at the seminary as well. I could take like a 2-day course or something, like an SU course,
Right.
to talk about like some aspects of, like here's how you can use YouTube, or here's, you know what I mean? Like those
Right.
sorts of things.
Yeah. Right.
That weren't like an all-encompassing. We were really building from scratch our own thing. There wasn't something already created. So it wasn't like I could go take a class and learn how to do it. I just was doing it on my own.
Yeah.
So I used the seminary to get the information and knowledge on what I really needed and didn't know and knew they had. And then I used my thought partner and my own exploration to build a thing that didn't exist.
Yeah. I love that because we could probably do a part 2 of this conversation and just talk about that, because it's hard to find somebody who is in that line of thinking. And I real quick, I'll just say that when I started my dissertation, a lot of people, this was before the pandemic, were like, it's digital ministry is like, it's like not real ministry kind of thing, because you have
Yes.
to be in person, in the flesh. You're not going to have real relationships. Like that's not real ministry, And then all of a sudden when the pandemic happened, after I did my dissertation, I remember I posted, I was like, does anybody want my dissertation? Because I have a how-to guide. I have some different ideas for you, because obviously this is a real thing.
Now it's real.
Exactly.
And the pandemic was an awful thing that happened
Yeah.
to this world,
Yeah.
like on a global scale. It's just really colossally traumatizing. It's just wild to me, like how we all survived this really devastating moment together and all have this shared lived experience as a nation, not a nation, as a globe.
The world. Yeah.
And I, in the same thoughts, also I'm like, I don't know that the church, some churches were, but the church, capital C church, would have ever really taken digital ministry seriously, except that moment happened.
You're 100%
Except we were
right.
forced to,
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's so many things, like you said, it was an awful time, but there's a lot of things I think that people are awakened to in the power of the virtual world, whether it's in church, even in businesses. A lot of businesses do a lot of virtual work now as well. So anyway, I think we can continue that, I think, on another time, because I already have a lot of questions for you. But we'll segue back into your book, In Trembling Boldness. Can you maybe begin, before I spill my questions all over the place, can you tell us about this book? Because it is a very unique book. Like I said before we hit record, there's not much out there that addresses this material in the way that you do. So can you tell us what this book is about? And most importantly, who's like your target audience? Who's the reader that you're going for?
In Trembling Boldness, Wisdom for Today from Ancient Jesus People is a introduction to some ancient texts, just a few of them. I think there's 8 in there. And also a collection of devotionals or reflections or meditations, whatever you want to call them, that use this extra canonical text as scripture, kind of like you would see in a traditional devotional.
Yep.
Some of them are telling stories of how people came across these texts, and we tried to, for the majority of those stories, center the experiences and lives of marginalized people. So people you generally don't see in a devotional: trans people, people of color, elderly people. Like there's just like, how do we tell those sorts of stories? And some of them are real stories from people that my co-author is also a minister and was the professor that got me interested in these texts, Reverend Dr. Hal Tausig. We were really interested in making sure that we shared these stories. Some of them are from us doing ministry in the world, and some of them are stories we made up, and some of them are our own stories, to try and get a variation and make sure that a lot of people who generally go unseen find themselves, right? And
Yeah.
in that same vein, we know that the universal is in the particular, but the universal has always skewed white, it's always skewed male, it's always skewed Christian. Um, so our goal was to still be able to make these very particular, like show this example that here's the particular and you've all found yourself there.
Yeah.
So what if you read marginalized stories and found you in it,
Hmm.
right? That
Yeah.
does some real community building work
Yeah. That's so
as a
good.
result.
Yeah, I love that. How did you like, how did you, obviously the Hal introduced you to the material, and he's been on the
Mhm.
show before a couple times, and
Hmm.
we talked about his New Testament, and he was on with a
Mm-hmm.
couple other guests. I forget their names off the top of my head, but they all wrote a book together. They were on the
Oh,
show
is it
together.
the before Christ,
Yes, I can't think of the title, but I
after
have all the words in my head, but I can't think of the
um
exact title. Before
after Jesus, before
Christianity.
Christianity?
Yes, that's the one.
Mm-hmm.
But they were on, they were talking about some of this material. But did you have any like association with these texts before you connected with Hal, or was he the introduction to them? And then like if whenever that happened, like was there any trepidation on your end when you got involved with these texts? Because we talked again before we hit record about how
Mm-hmm.
for myself and a lot of our listeners, we've been told these are so evil, they're so bad, they're gonna drag you away from the true word kind of thing. Like did
Mm.
any of that, did you wrestle with any of those things or not really?
I had not heard of any of these texts before I got to seminary. I don't,
Mm,
in my best recollection, maybe I did and didn't think anything of them, because of that same reason, like you don't look at those.
yep.
But I didn't, I grew up CME, so there's other texts that we weren't engaged in either, like
Hmm.
there's a whole apocrypha in some people's Bibles that I'm like, what do you do with that?
Right.
Like,
What is
I don't know what that
that?
is either.
Right.
So I don't think I ever had any real trepidation around them. I do think the environment helped that I met them in seminary,
Hmm.
not day one,
Yep.
like yeah, it was probably the second semester. Was it second semester or was it I think it was, yeah, towards the end of second semester or so that I got introduced to these texts.
Hmm.
And I was just curious. And there was someone who could talk to me about them who actually knew some stuff about,
Yeah.
um, for a lot of these scholars who work with that, they also know the context and the region. Like that's really the point and goal, right?
Hmm.
Not like trying to, and I feel like this is like that with any of these scholars, like not trying to do some like faith work of interpretation, but here's what the text says, and here's what that meant in that time because we know
Yep.
this, and this.
Yep.
And you can do that all the way down the line with all of our traditional texts. Like,
Hmm.
so this is just doing that work. Um, me as a minister, then I'm wondering like, so then what? So now what? So why does it matter
Hmm.
as we live our lives? And if these other texts matter for how we live our lives, then I think these probably do too.
Mm.
And reading them um, informs what you thought you knew and gives you a wider understanding of the divine, because you have a wider understanding of the time period in which people were thinking this and what they were thinking and what was happening with them.
Mm.
So it's, to me, it's just I don't see the downside in it, right? Like the
Sure.
only thing it can do is make your relationship with God more expansive.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was in seminary, I always say that I'm jealous isn't the word, but I feel like I missed out because like the school I went to, we did a lot of history and stuff like that and culture in regards to the biblical texts. But when it came to these
Hmm.
texts, I was told
Hmm.
by a lot of professors like there's just nothing in there for you to know, and we're just not going to
Oh,
talk about
that's
them kind of thing.
fascinating.
And I was really told like those things will lead you in other directions. I was like, okay, and I was like the good Christian soldier, like all right, I'm just not going to touch
Hmm.
it. No, I'm going to do my thing and keep doing my work. And when I started the podcast and I started rethinking my faith, everything like that, I started to dig into some of these things. I read, I think it was like Elaine, I think it was Elaine Pagels, it might have been Hal, I don't
Hmm.
remember who it was, but somebody said to me on the podcast, like these texts matter to somebody. Like these
Hmm.
texts informed somebody's faith. For whatever reason, church fathers were saying they should be destroyed, get rid of them. Somebody put them away for some reason, whether because they meant
That
something
part.
to them, they wanted future generations to have them. They wanted to defy whatever it is, whatever the reason is, they mattered to somebody. And shouldn't they then matter to us in some way? And that was like really interesting to me because that put like a lot of humanity on these texts. Whereas in school, it was
Hmm.
all about, specific pieces of theology that, aren't the right way to think. But when you take that away and you realize that these texts matter to somebody, they inform somebody's faith. And then I came across Bart Ehrman's book, Lost Christianities, and the plural Christianities. So it's like
Hmm.
many Christianities. I was like, what is this about? And I
Hmm.
started to really read about that and really began to realize like that the Orthodox faith that I was handed was just one narrow stream of many streams of thinking. And a lot of these other texts fell into those other streams of thinking, whether it's the Valentinians or it's the, whatever branch of Gnostics there were, whatever. But these
Hmm.
were people who considered themselves Christians. They just
Hmm.
thought differently than that narrow Orthodox way. And I think that, again, like it just helped me realize, like, oh, I can be a Christian even if I don't fall in this very narrow lane anymore. There's other places for me to land. And I can even adopt different things and I can think my own way, but yet still be in that lane of Christianity, which really meant a lot for me just in my own faith journey. So
Yeah. It's I do think that I'm very lucky or divinely aligned, I guess depends on what you
whatever
believe.
term you want to use.
Yeah, that I ended up at Union,
Mm,
a space that is very open, Union Theological in New York City, very open to letting you sort out, working out your own salvation, you know, with fear and trembling boldness. Is important there. So however you discern this thing, like you got to
yeah,
do it because you got to own it versus like, let me tell you what you should think about this. And then good luck carrying that through your whole life if it's rooted in somebody else, right? And what
sure.
somebody else told you, what somebody else thinks.
Yeah.
So that whole deconstruction that
Mhm.
a lot of people are experiencing are because they've been carrying someone else's theology versus having a
Yeah,
space to build their own,
that's
right?
right.
Like as a kid, what if you gave children space to ask these what if questions
Yeah,
and then answer them as honestly and authentically as you can
yeah,
so that they can rightly discern how they hold and what measures up for them around their budding moral compass,
that's right. That's
you
right.
know.
You're preaching now. Preaching now.
That'll preach.
That's right. So how did you come to decide what books you were going to write about? Because for our listeners, I'm just going to read off a list of some of them that are in here, but you talk
Okay.
about Gospel of Thomas, the Thunder Perfect Mind, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Gospel of Mary is in here, Gospel of Truth, the Thought of Noria, Odes of Solomon, and Prayer of Thanksgiving. Like there's a couple in here that I wasn't even aware of. But there's also a
Mm.
lot obviously that are not in here because there's literally hundreds of them. So I'm curious, like how did you and Hal decide which ones were going to be included? Were there any that were kind of on the cusp of making it in but didn't make the cut? Like what was that process like for you guys?
I imagine there were. Now I'm like, what were they? I think what happened first is we wrote a bunch of devotionals.
Mm,
And then in the narrowing down process, you know, that's we ended up with the text we got. I
mhm,
work primarily with Thunder Perfect Mind, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Odes of Solomon,
mhm.
and a little bit of Gospel of Thomas. Like those are my worlds.
Yeah.
I think if I were to go do a PhD on any of that, I'd have to narrow even further because there's enough, right? Those texts by themselves are enough rather than like, let me just try and know the whole of the thing, right?
Yeah.
Um, or maybe I could, I don't know. Anyway. And then Hal is a scholar of all of first and second century and all of these texts. Honestly, I think he probably goes all the way up to the fourth. I'm not sure. Let me not speak for his
He knows a lot
vast
of things.
knowledge.
Put it that
Yeah.
way.
But yeah, so that's where some of these other texts came in, like
Mm,
the prayer of Thanksgiving. I've also spent some time on, but it's not like my scholarly work.
mhm.
Uh, the thought of Norea, same situation, Gospel of Mary. So some of these, like, I've had a fair amount of interaction with, but as far as like me giving you some real uh contextual grounding for them, like
Yeah.
he is the one that kind of holds that more.
Yeah.
So I think that we ended up narrowing down because of the text that we just like to read and look at and have found life-giving for us.
Mm-hmm.
And then like what devotionals have we already written and can we, put in a collection itself, right? Like you'll notice the Odes of Solomon has a lot of devotionals, whereas I think the Prayer of Thanksgiving probably has a whole, probably 2 or 3 there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because the Odes of Solomon is a collection of worship material, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's written kind of, or it lends itself easily to something like this,
Yeah. Mm.
whereas the Prayer of Thanksgiving is 1 page. It's a
Yep.
1-page prayer,
Yeah.
So what are you able to like really, I always say, is the juice worth the squeeze?
Sure.
What are you really able to, what juice can you get from that versus
Yeah.
like, 41 odes?
Yeah. That's so good. All right. So I want to ask you about kind of like a two-sided question. Number one is
Mhm.
about some of the similarities between these texts and what we might find in the traditional scriptures, and then also the
Mhm.
differences. So first, some of the similarities, because again, like a lot of things I was told, people who are listening were told, is the stuff in here is vastly different than everything that you're going to find
Mm.
in the Bible. It's almost like it's a different religion kind of thing. But I know in my own journey through some of this material, and it's very young in this journey, but some of the things I've read, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of similarities, especially like in the Gospel of Thomas. There's a lot of differences, but there's also things where I'll read, I'm like, oh, I remember Jesus saying this in Luke or Jesus saying this in Matthew. So what are some of like the similarities that you've come across in your own studying of this stuff between these texts and some of the biblical texts?
I mean, so a lot of them were written around the same time, right?
That's another thing I was told that's not true, is that they were written so far after.
That's not true. Yeah, first and
Yep.
second century are the ones that I spend my time with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also they then had access to each other, right?
Yep.
So Gospel of Thomas being a great example here is literally just a list of sayings and deeds. Like Jesus said this, Jesus said this, he said this, he said this, he did this, he
Like
did this, he
rapid
said this,
fire.
he said this, he said this, he said
Right.
this. That's yeah. And so then when you read the other gospels, you notice when they start to midrash, right?
Yeah.
Let's put a little story in here. Let's put some meat on the bones here. Let's get, and I don't know, we don't know like
Mm-hmm.
who had access to what first and how,
Yep.
like we can guesstimate and based off of what we research and whatnot. But I'm curious, like, then like, are you holding Gospel of Thomas, or have you
Mm-hmm.
read it? And then like, as you are also telling this story, 50 years, 85 years, whatever, after the death of Jesus, if someone asked me to remember something from 20 years ago, I might remember like something specific being said to me. Might remember some specific thing that happened,
Yeah.
but the context of the stuff around that, what did I have for breakfast that morning? Where had I just come from? Where was I going later?
Yeah.
Might be a little fuzzy,
Mm-hmm.
Um, so all of these were in conversation with each other and trying to consider the audience that they were trying to speak to, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do I say this in the way that this audience is really going to hold this with me? And then it like, so for me, that means like Mark, right, is the first, he's the oldest in the first gospel. So then the other ones are like, okay, let's like take this one and add a little juice in there. Like,
Yeah.
this is how this would work for me.
Mm-hmm.
The author of Luke, this is how this would work for me. The author of Matthew, John is
Mm-hmm.
like doing his own thing. But so yeah, I think in that way, it's important that we recognize that all of these came together around the same time as each other and
Yeah.
were important, like texts that were being read regularly up until what I think the 15th century, if I'm remembering correctly,
Mm-hmm.
is when, we essentially, our canon comes together a little more haphazardly than we like to admit,
Right.
where we like found a letter that a bishop wrote that was an Easter letter that was like, here are the texts that you should be reading,
Mm-hmm.
but not really knowing that this is what they did every single year, is sent this letter that's like, here's the text that you should be reading.
Mm-hmm.
And it stuck, and that's the ones that we got,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that letter was written in 15, and then we found the letter, what, 16 or
I
something,
think it
or
was like
maybe,
mid 16 or I don't,
yeah, and
yeah,
that
something.
was
It was late. It
also
was later than I
exactly
was
when
ever told.
yeah, and that's also when the printing press came
Right.
about. And so
Yeah.
then they were like, then it was solidified
Right.
because it was mass produced,
Yeah.
versus before people could read it, but it was fine because somebody else is reading this. And the next year you're going to get some different text to read because this is like, let's talk about this framing this year,
Yeah.
kind of like how churches do themes now, but we kind of let that go when we like solidified the canon.
Mm. Yeah. When I read when I came across Gospel of Thomas and learned about, some people say that's the Q document. Some people say there's a different Q document,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
But there's some kind of list of sayings. When I started really reading Thomas and thinking about the Gospels, I felt like it made so much more sense as to why the stories were different, because it's not like, they were recording necessarily like the Jesus cam following him around, giving
Mm.
historical events, but they were forming these stories around these sayings to fit the particular thing that their audience was going through. And then I feel like that for me, like I'm a very creative thinker, so I feel like that for me freed up a whole lot of my mind to like imagine, like I wonder why Mark told the story this way, knowing that these people were living in the wake of like Nero's wrath kind of thing, or people of Matthew living in the wake of the temple falling. I wonder why the writer of Matthew wrote the story like this, and how that would have really fit with what these people were going through. And I feel like
Yeah.
when you think about that and you let your mind kind of go, I feel like it again, like the Gospel of Thomas really informed the way that I read the Gospels.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so what about the differences then? Let's talk about some of those, because like for instance, you said the Gospel of Mary is one of your wheelhouses that you were in. There's some things in the
Oh,
Gospel
not
of
not
Mary.
really, not that one.
Oh no.
Minor, Thunder Perfect Mind, Acts of Paul and Thecla,
Oh, that's right.
Odes
Acts
of
of Paul and Thecla.
Solomon,
Yeah.
and a little bit of Thomas.
Yeah. Okay.
But
So in
I really love the Gospel of Mary, but yeah, that one's
me too. That one has blown my mind a little bit. And there's some things in there that
mm-hmm.
yeah, there's just a lot in there. But what are some things that you've come across, whether it's in there or these other texts have that are different than what you have
Mm-hmm.
found in the traditional gospels, that maybe are far off, or maybe it's something that's made you think differently about something that is in the text? Like what are some of those examples?
Mm. I think it's interesting, like we tend to think that these texts are so very different from what we have. Um, and in a lot of ways they just aren't. They are really similar. Like
Mhm.
what I was getting ready to say was like, oh, well, some of them aren't like Christocentric, like they don't say Christ, but we have texts in our New Testament that don't say Christ,
True.
so
Yep.
and we've decided that still means that they fit,
Yep.
because that's the book, that's where they are. They live in our
Mhm.
book, right, in our canon, and that's been ordained.
Yep. It's
Um,
closed.
yeah, so I'm like, "Oh, what makes them different?" I think, nope. I was gonna say like some of the fantastical storying, but then we have Revelation, so
Right. But then there's that book. It's a little bit fantastical in itself.
I'm like, what's different? Um, the prayer of Thanksgiving is really just a prayer. That's the
Hmm.
whole text.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we have another text in our traditional canon that's like that.
Mm.
It's short. We also don't have one that's that short. And then there are women who are clearly at the center of the narrative. That feels different.
Hmm.
Um, and even like titled as such, right? Like
Hmm.
the Gospel of Mary, we don't have anything in our traditional canon that is the Gospel of insert woman name here, right?
Yeah.
Um, and there are three texts that come to mind immediately, right? Like the Acts of Paul and Thecla
Hmm.
being one, the Gospel of Mary, and then Thunder Perfect Mind is the story of this deity that mostly identifies as female.
Hmm.
sometimes identifies as male. And so it might be okay to say trans,
Mm-hmm.
in that way. We don't know, but we do know that it's not a mistake it's not a typo. We used to think it was a
Sure.
typo. And so we were mistakenly translating it differently. There's one passage where Thunder says, I am he, the mother.
Mm.
And it's like, oh no, they clearly meant she, the mother, right? Let me
Mm-hmm.
just like fix that when I do my little English translation. But no, that's
Right.
like what they meant, right?
Yeah.
And so having to recognize that a lot of the stuff that we want to act like are anomalies and didn't exist um, and all of that then and do now, well, clearly that must be, outside of what it's supposed to be, but that's not the case. They were there then,
Yeah.
um, and maybe it wasn't an anomaly. Maybe this is just like what the world is. And so it teaches us different holding for what we are experiencing today,
Yeah.
and how we have crafted a world that shuts people out,
Mm-hmm.
because of what we think it says and what we thought it was. And so introduction to texts like that um, teach us an ancient history, teach us an ancestral holding
Mm-hmm.
of communal belonging,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah. I think one of the ones for me that has came across as very different at first, but then once I started to see it, now I see things in the biblical text that are in this other book, but the gospel of truth. And that's not
Mm-hmm.
it's I feel like
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit of a deeper book in a lot of different ways, but
Mm-hmm.
then
It's
there's
beautiful book though.
yeah, 90% of it I don't understand. I'll open about that, but there's this one part where it talks about, and I'm gonna get it wrong, but it talks about how the main problem that we have as humans, rather than being sinful or whatever, is that we forget. Like forgetfulness is our
Mm-hmm.
biggest
Mm-hmm.
problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that just awakened like so much in me because I'm like, isn't that like the truth? Like if
Mm-hmm.
the Bible says that we're, God breathed into Adam, so the breath of God is in all of us. We're made in the image of
Mm-hmm.
God. I mean, it says that in our Bible, but how often do we just forget that, and we pick up our
Mm-hmm.
baggage from
Mm-hmm.
the world?
Mm-hmm.
We live like this, we live like that, we do this, we do that, and that image gets so easily covered up, but it's still there. And for me, that's been helpful for my daughter because my daughter's in first grade, and so she knows I do the podcast. She says, you have all these
Mm-hmm.
Jesus
Mm-hmm.
books all over the place, and so we talk a lot about like Jesus, and she asks about like the cross and what's that about. And I've been talking to her about like sometimes we just forget who we are. Like we're all made in the image of God. We're made to be in this way, these loving people, these kind people, but we forget that. Don't you forget that sometimes? She's like, yeah, I forget that all the time. Like, yeah, me too. But
Mm-hmm.
when I look at Jesus and I look at when he was put on the cross and the way he responded and, his love and his forgiveness he poured out, I said, it reminds me of who I really am. And I said, so in that way, it's like a salvation moment every single day, when I forget who I am. And it's just that
Mm-hmm.
for me, like that brought a whole new life to the gospel. But now when I read a lot of these gospel stories, I see that in there. It's been there the whole
Mm-hmm.
time. I just never really saw it
Mm-hmm.
before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love that framing that about how we forget.
Yeah. I feel like
It's
it
always there.
brings a whole different angle to it. So
Mm-hmm.
last question for
Lest I
you.
forget.
Well, I'm sorry.
I was just thinking that song, Lest I Forget,
Yeah. Yeah.
Gethsemane.
Yep. Definitely. So how does this stuff work its way into your everyday life? Like do you read this stuff on a regular basis? Like you're a pastor, so does it make your way into any kind of teachings? Do you reference it, kind of off the cuff if you're
Mm-hmm.
doing a teaching, like, oh, it says in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, blah, 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 or do you, I'm curious about how it makes its way into your personal life and then how it makes its way into your ministry, as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I fully preach these texts. I preach from it was so funny. I just preached this past Sunday and someone was like, "Oh my gosh, you're preaching like from the lectionary, you're preaching from the Bible." I was like, "I know, twice in 1 year." Like that's how
What a
how
heretic.
rarely I preach
Right.
from that I generally would preach the extra canonical texts,
Hmm.
because they are so aligned, right?
Yeah.
It's an easy win in that way. And then you're also teaching people this expansiveness
Mm.
of their faith, of their understanding of the divine, of the time period in the community, you know.
Yeah.
So in that way, I interact with them a lot. And then I wrote an album that was just that ended up being a project that for school
Mm.
when I was in seminary from Hal's class. He had a class called Opening Canon, and there were like two big projects. One of them was a paper, and the other one didn't have to be whatever we wanted it to be. And so I wrote songs
Mm.
using these texts, and so in that way they always live in me. Um, whether I read them just because I like the stories, or whether
Right.
I'm writing something, or yeah, I don't know. My A New Testament and what is one of the more beat up books on
Hmm.
my bookshelf
Same.
as a result. Um, because it's just juicy,
Yeah.
There's just a lot in there, and you similar to the Bible, you can't read them enough and think that you've got it.
Yep.
You've solved it, mischief managed.
Yep.
Every single time I read it, there's something else
Yeah.
there that makes
Hmm.
me think, um, consider something maybe in a different way. And I
Yeah.
think that's so valuable, right? Like, what a gift that is
Yep.
to be able to do that. And then oftentimes also, I'm able to connect it with something else that I've read in our traditional
Hmm.
New Testament text, and helps me connect what's happening over there, right? Like,
Yep.
oh, okay, so there aren't any women who are named, but they were certainly like women who were in charge.
Yep.
And the Bible is trying to say that in some ways, in the subversive ways it's trying to say it,
Yeah.
based on like what we know about that time period and what would have been allowed, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, what I love about what you just said is that like you're bringing this into. I was curious if you brought it into church, and obviously you do since you preach from these texts. But I think it's so good to that you're normalizing this stuff for people, because I know there are a lot of
Mhm.
people I've heard different things about these things, but I think when they see somebody like yourself who is educated and who is standing in a pulpit and is able to bring these ideas down to them, it's almost like you're touching these taboo topics, but you're bringing them out into the light to show there's really nothing to be afraid of, because like you said, there are so many overlaps, there are so many similarities. We can read something here
Mhm.
in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which can really inform what we're reading over here in some of our traditional
Mhm.
texts. And I think that
Mhm.
when people see that, it really helps normalize things. I think that your book and Hal's obviously New Testament have really done that for people. So props to you.
Thanks. Yeah, we had a
Yeah.
great time writing it. I'm so grateful that I got to work with one of my mentors, like, that he was willing to, help me do this thing, and
Yeah.
he's always trying to see how we can help people get their foot in the door around publishing. And
Yeah.
so I'm just, grateful to have a mentor like him.
So good. Well, we're just about out of time, but this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for taking time for me and for our listeners, and thanks for the work you do.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great. I
Yeah, for
appreciate it.
sure. And real quick, where can people go to find you online? Any place to go in particular to connect with you, or
I'm Diva Does Divinity on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Well, formerly known as Twitter,
whatever it
and now
is?
X.
Elon Musk
And
land.
also on Threads.
Yeah.
But yeah, or go to middlechurch.org. That's where I am. I serve as a digital minister there. Um, and that's where, like, if you're wanting to try and have some sort of conversation, that would be the best place to start versus showing up in my DMs.
Awesome.
I do not have time for all that.
Right. Who does, right? I don't even go in there sometimes.
Truth. Like, don't do it.
That's
Just
right.
email me at the church.
Awesome. I'll put the links in the show notes, and we'll do this again sometime maybe.
All right. Thank you so much.